Hello, folks. Phil Gallagher of ThrabenU here for my Kaldheim set review for Legacy. I've done this sort of thing for most sets over the last year or two, although I've usually done them as a stream. This time I'm going to try to keep things more concise and try to keep this video to about 10 minutes. And part of the reason that I'm able to do this is because, honestly, there aren't that many cards that are going to be Legacy playable in this set, not even Fringe playable. And I can't tell you how fucking excited I am about that fact. The last year, really the last 2 years, have just hit us over the head with incredibly pushed card after pushed card after pushed card. Arn, Urko, Oo. Oo? Uwu? Uro, Icefang Coatl, Underworld Breach, Luris, Zerda. You get the idea here. And every set has just fundamentally done an upheaval on the Legacy format. And every set, it's been like Legacy from square one again. And there's been a lot of bans, and who knows, maybe we'll see more bans soon. But I'm very happy to say that this set looks relatively tame in comparison. So in a lot of my other set reviews, I've had like a spreadsheet worth of stuff, and I've talked about like literally 20 cards. But this time around, I'm just going to highlight 5 cards, and of these, really only 2 are probably realistically going to see a good amount of Legacy play, and the remainder of them will be things that will show up in some of the fun deck lists that I'll play from time to time, and they will potentially have some Legacy uses. Anyway, I hope you enjoy, and if you enjoy this bite-sized content and you want to see more like it, please considering liking, commenting on the video, or subscribing in particular. Trying to hit 3K sometime soon. Let's jump right into things. Okay, like let's not mess around with it and try to hype what's gonna be the #1 legacy playable card from the set. It's Valky. It's Valky Lord, or sorry, God of Lies, aka Tybalt Cosmic Imposter. This is really the only card that has serious chances of seeing a widespread amount of legacy play, in my opinion. And that's because this is one of those cards where it's two sides put together creates a card that is better than either one of the sides, because either one of the sides on their own is not particularly legacy playable. So let's take a look at the front half. So when this ETBs, each opponent reveals their hand, and they exile a creature card until Valky leaves the battlefield. You can pay X and choose a creature card exiled with Valky, and then it becomes a copy of that card. Are there perhaps any snowbally cards printed in the last 2 years that might be really cool to transform into early? Oh, I don't know. Maybe a Dreadhorde Arcanist? Maybe an Uro? There's some gross things that you can snipe with this relatively early. And in some weird fringe scenarios, you can grab some medium to large size creature out of your opponent's hand, a questing beast, a knight of the reliquary, even something crazy like a Grizzlebrand, and create your own copy of it. That's pretty cool. Now, notably, this card isn't gone forever. When Valky leaves play, the opponent gets their card back. Now, is this on its own a playable legacy card? Yeah, no, not so much. Okay, so why are we looking at this? It's because this card has a backside as well. And we know that a whole bunch of the modal double-faced cards have seen widespread play in Legacy, especially in Oops, All Spells, where they were huge improvements to things that were already there. Okay, now this is the side that really matters, though. When Tybalt ETBs, you get an emblem with you can play cards exiled with Tybalt, and you may spend mana as though it was mana of any color to cast those spells. So this thing enters with 5 loyalty, and then when it +2s, you exile 2 separate cards. And in a weird sort of way, that's kind of like a +2 draw 2. That's pretty strong. It has a minus ability that lets you exile an artifact or creature, and then for a -8, you can exile all cards from graveyards and add 3 red. So ignore that last ability. That's not particularly great. This is it can be with the exiled cards, like don't get me wrong, it has its purposes, but we're here for the plus and minus, and particularly the plus. Okay, so you have a creature in the early game that can be a 2/1 that can attack and maybe disrupt an opponent in the short term. Every once in a while, do something super cool. And you have a planeswalker in the end game that has a crap ton of loyalty and relatively strong abilities. The thing that's actually going to make this card playable is the cascade mechanic, though. If you use something like a shardless agent and hit a Valky, what you can do is actually cast the backside of that card, which is actually legitimately interesting. So on turn 3, theoretically, you can go and cast a shardless agent into a Tybalt. And you know how annoying it is for an early Oko hitting the table? Well, this is an early Planeswalker that is going to effectively start with 7 loyalty. And this one doesn't just get pyroblasted. And this is what's going to make this card potentially the most playable card of the entire set. Is this card actually good enough to bring a Cascade deck back? That's a trickier question. I know a whole bunch of brewers will be very excited about this card and be looking to try it. Whether or not this is going to be significantly better than things like Ancestral Vision or Crashing Footfalls, that's the thing that we're really going to have to determine to see how playable this card truly is. The second best card in this set is probably Weathered Runestone, at least for Legacy fans. So this card is incredibly similar to existing effects. So why do we want a 2-mana Graveyard Hate card? What does this possibly do? Well, if you view this as a turn 2 play, this isn't particularly good. It's fine, but probably not what you're looking for a lot of the time. This card is potentially very good in Ancient Tomb decks, where this is still a playable turn 1 play, and it ends up being a bit of an upgrade over Grafdigger's Cage, partially due to the ever so slightly different text, and partially due to the fact that it doesn't get hit by your own Chalice on 1. Here's the issue, though. What deck actually wants this card? That is a little bit harder. You see, most of the Chalice of the Void Ancient Tomb decks are currently Leyline of the Void decks. And that's the primary way that they go about using Graveyard Hate. And if they have a 5th piece of Graveyard Hate, it is almost always Tormod's Crypt, because that's fetchable and playable for free off of Karn the Great Creator. So this is a card of the correct power level to see Legacy play, and it almost has a home. But whether or not this actually goes and finds a spot where this sees widespread play instead of just occasional sideboard play, that is much trickier to say. This is a card that I got excited about it when I first saw it, and then I went, where do I put it? Next up, we have Snakeskinvale, which is a card that could see play in Legacy, in fact. This is just a common. It's not a pushed card, and this is very, very similar to something like Blossoming Events that already exists in the deck. So you can trade +2 power in the short term for a +1/+1 counter that sticks around for a little bit longer. And +1/+1 counters are particularly interesting in fact right now because of the prevalence of cards like Plague Engineer, where you might use a pump spell to save your creature for 1 turn, but then a Plague Engineer comes down later and wipes your board, or at least some important portion of your board. And say putting a +1/+1 counter on something like an Inkmoth Nexus could mean that that creature gets to keep attacking in future turns, whereas normally it might be turned off. This is not a particularly exciting upgrade, and maybe even calling it an upgrade isn't quite accurate, but this is going to be an option for Infect pilots moving forward. Next up, we start getting into the cards that are kind of reaching, and they really require what is potentially too much work to be worth the payoff. And the first one of these is bloodsky Berserker. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, put 2 +1/+1 counters on this card. It gains menace until the end of turn. So my immediate comparison for you is to Sprite Dragon, which is seeing a fair amount of legacy play currently because it's just a powerful effect. Things that spiral and snowball over time are pretty good in legacy right now. The thing about Sprite Dragon, though, is you cast 1 spell, it's still good. You cast 2 spells, oh, it's better. You cast 3 spells, ho 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 ho. But with bloodsky Berserker, it's a little bit more situational. So if you're not casting 2 spells in a turn, you're not necessarily getting great value out of this card. So why are we talking about it then? I find that Delver style decks often try to take advantage of the newest sort of quirky threat immediately after set release to see if it's good. So while I don't know that this card is actually legitimately good in a Delver style shell, it's something that I expect people to try at the very least in some sort of Grixis Delver style deck. Um, there may be some problems with being Grixis right now because of how good green is currently, but like this is a card you should have on your radar. Ultimately, this may also find play in some sort of fringe mono black deck, the sort of shenanigans that often appears on my channel. Like when you cast this card and then you go like, oh, I thought sees you him to Torok you afterwards, attack you for 3. That's pretty good. Like you Dark Ritual Planeswalker the next turn or something like that. That's pretty good. So this is a card that can snowball, so I want to keep an eye on it, but ultimately I don't think this one sees a lot of play. All right, so rounding out my top 5 is Tibolts Trickery, which is a card I'm going to read the exact text of because it's a little confusing the first time you read it. Counter target spell. Choose 1, 2, or 3 at random. Its controller mills that many cards, then exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card with a different name than that spell. They may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then they put the exiled cards on the bottom of their library in a random order. Okay, so what do we do with this? There is a potential unfair use of this, where you do something like cast a cascade spell, cascade into Tibolt's Trickery, mill yourself, and then you create an Emrakul. If you are willing to play a glass cannon deck with, and I can't emphasize this enough, with zero game against anything that can interact with your combo, you can produce an Emrakul extremely consistently if that's a thing that you want to do. However, if you want to be executing that combo consistently, it basically means that you're playing lands, 1 cascade spell, and Tibolt's Trickery, and at that point, you might be better off playing something like Oops or Doomsday that like tries to do the thing, but still has game if it doesn't work. There is also a fair use to this card. A deck like Red Prison often has trouble dealing with specific types of decks. Show and Tell, for example. It just doesn't have a lot of game around that because, like, if they just naturally assemble Show and Tell plus creature, then that comes down, it ignores the Chalice that's in play, or they can outweight a Thorn of Amethyst effect, and you die to it. So this is an awkward counterspell in that it still gives the opponent some value, but there may be situations where this ends up being playable in some sort of stompy sideboard. Now, that said, the sideboards of those decks are pretty tight right now since most of them include a Karn the Great Creator package. And because of that, do you really have room in your sideboard to mess around with a Tibolt's Trickery? Ugh, that's a little bit dubious. And it's not like this spell is just a slam dunk when it actually resolves anyway. There's still some degree of risk with it. So that ends the list of cards that I think are actually probably potentially legacy playable. And like, really, of those, only the first 2 are probably going to see much play. I do want to give an honorable mention, though, to In Search of Greatness. I'm going to read this one real quick. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may cast a permanent spell from your hand with CMC equal to 1 plus the highest converted mana cost among other permanents you control without paying its mana cost. If you don't, scry 1. This is a card that I think would probably make a fun legacy deck. Not a good legacy deck, but a fun legacy deck. Pokimoki pointed out that I could probably play a card like this in a like Yorian Birthing Pod style deck and get a pretty sick degree of value out of it. So some people saw this and they were like, hold on, you get to Black Lotus like immediately the next turn, not realizing that this says other permanents. So this card probably isn't realistically legacy playable in a tournament sense, but if you want to dick around and like cast a bunch of creatures in a ridiculous shell, you can probably do some very fun things with this card. I would like to take just a moment here to plug one of my fellow content creators. pvdh did a lot of work in putting together a more exhaustive legacy set review for Kaldheim. That includes a lot of infographics as well as descriptions of a whole bunch of cards. And I'm going to go ahead and link to his Reddit post in the comment that has his individual links to his reviews of each one of these cards. And this goes into way more detail than I went into and talks about a lot of the fringe cards. Um, but if you notice, he's kind of in agreement with me here that there's really only one card that maybe has the possibility of empowering an archetype, and then almost everything else in this set is just like fringe, not quite there. So the overall power level of this set is much, much normal. Sorry, much, much lower than what we're used to seeing in the past year. Overall, I am happy with the set as a legacy player, and I'm happy that we're not getting another earth-shattering round of cards. I don't know that my heart could take it. Now, if you think I've called some of these wrong, yell at me in the comments. If you think, oh man, but that one red ritual can get you to the mana to cast an Uro, or it can change the colors of your mana when you're playing Oops, and you've convinced me that you want to convince me that I'm wrong, throw that out there in the comments so you have it on record, that you made your called shots. Because I know sometimes I get these things right. Like I nailed Dreadhorde Arcanist when that one came out, but I totally missed Oko, for example. All right, have a great rest of the day, folks.